Conrad Fisher never imagined that a simple coffee run would shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. The tech billionaire was rushing through downtown Portland on a crisp October morning, already 15 minutes late for a board meeting that would determine the fate of his latest AI venture, when fate intervened in the most unexpected way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, sitting alone on the steps of the old Carnegie Library, her small frame wrapped in a faded purple coat that had seen better days. What stopped Conrad in his tracks wasn't her obvious distress or the way she clutched a worn stuffed elephant to her chest. It was the way she turned her head toward his approaching footsteps with the precise attention of someone who'd navigated the world through sound rather than sight. Her eyes, clouded with the telltale signs of congenital blindness, seemed to look right through him as he slowed his hurried pace. Conrad had learned to notice these details during his own daughter's brief battle with a rare eye condition 2 years earlier, a battle they'd ultimately lost along with his wife, Rachel, who died in the same car accident that had taken little Emma's sight before claiming her life entirely. "Excuse me, sweetheart," Conrad said, crouching down to the child's level, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping against the concrete steps. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The little girl tilted her head with the careful attention of someone processing not just words, but voice patterns, breathing rhythms, and the subtle environmental cues that sighted people took for granted. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of old soul wisdom that sometimes emerged from children who'd faced too much hardship too young. "My mama went inside to talk to the social worker lady. She's trying to find me a new family because she can't take care of me anymore since Daddy went to heaven." The words hit Conrad like a physical blow. Here was a child facing the kind of loss and abandonment that no young person should have to endure, speaking about it with the matter-of-fact acceptance that suggested this wasn't her first conversation about being unwanted. "I'm sure they'll find you a wonderful family," Conrad said gently, though the words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what this little girl was facing. "What's your name?" "Luna Rodriguez." She replied, then did something that would haunt Conrad's dreams and change the trajectory of both their lives forever. She reached out with the unerring accuracy of someone who'd learned to navigate through touch, her small hand finding his face with startling precision. Her fingers traced the outline of his jaw, moved across his cheekbones, and finally settled over his eyes with a touch so gentle it felt like butterfly wings. "You have my dead daddy's eyes," Luna whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and heartbreak that seemed to compress all human emotion into 6 simple words. Conrad's world tilted off its axis. The busy street around them, the honking cars, the chattering pedestrians, the distant sound of construction faded into white noise as Luna's words echoed in his mind. Dead Daddy's eyes. How could this blind child, this complete stranger, possibly know anything about her father's eyes, let alone recognize some similarity in Conrad's eyes? "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Conrad managed, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. His hands trembled slightly as he gently covered her small fingers with his own, the gesture both protective and desperate for connection. "She showed me pictures before," Luna explained, with the patient tone of someone accustomed to explaining the unexplainable. "She used to let me touch Daddy's face in the photographs and tell me about his eyes. Said they were the color of storm clouds and that they crinkled at the corners when he smiled real big. She said I'd know them anywhere, even if I couldn't see them." Conrad felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crack at the foundation. Storm cloud eyes. It was an oddly specific description, and one that multiple people had used to describe his own unusual gray-blue irises over the years. But thousands of people probably had similar eye color and laugh lines. This had to be coincidence. the kind of random intersection of grief and hope that created meaning where none actually existed. Yet something deeper than logic was stirring in Conrad's chest, a recognition that felt cellular, primitive, like his body understood something his mind refused to accept. Luna's delicate features, now that he really looked at them, carried traces of familiarity that made his breath catch. The shape of her nose, the stubborn set of her jaw when she concentrated, even the way she tilted her head when processing new information, all of it triggered memories he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they were dreams. "Luna," he said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "what was your daddy's name?" Before she could answer, the library's heavy oak doors swung open with a groan of protest, and a woman emerged who looked like she'd been wrestling with impossible decisions and losing. Tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, moved with the exhausted grace of someone who'd been strong for so long that strength had become a burden rather than a gift. "Luna, baby, we need to—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Conrad kneeling beside her daughter, her eyes widening with an expression that cycled rapidly through suspicion, recognition, and something that looked disturbingly like terror. "Oh my God," she breathed, one hand flying to cover her mouth while the other reached protectively toward Luna. "It's really you. After all these years, it's actually you." Conrad rose slowly to his feet, his mind racing to process what was happening. This woman knew him. Somehow, impossibly, both she and Luna were connected to him in ways that defied explanation. The successful businessman who'd built his fortune on logic, data, and calculated risks found himself face to face with a mystery that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his own history. "I think," Conrad said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "we need to talk." What he didn't know was that this conversation would reveal a secret that had been buried for 7 years, expose a lie that had shaped his entire adult life, and force him to confront the possibility that the family he had mourned might not be as lost as he had believed. The child whose words had stopped him on a busy street corner was about to become the key to unlocking a truth that would transform them both in ways neither could have imagined. But first, Luna had one more thing to say that would make Conrad's knees nearly buckle with the weight of recognition and impossible hope. "Mama," Luna said, her blind eyes still focused on Conrad's face with startling accuracy, "I think I found him. I think I found my real daddy." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Conrad thought he understood about reality. Luna's small hand still rested against his cheek, her touch both innocent and devastating, while her mother, whose name he still didn't know, stared at him with an expression that suggested she was seeing a ghost. "Come here, Mama," the woman said, her voice carefully controlled but trembling at the edges. "We've talked about this. Your daddy can't come back, remember?" But Conrad found himself unable to step away from the child whose simple declaration had just torn a hole in his carefully ordered world. Every instinct he developed as a CEO, the ability to assess situations quickly, to separate emotion from fact, to make decisive moves in uncertain circumstances, seemed to abandon him in the face of Luna's unwavering certainty. "What's your name?" Conrad asked the woman, though part of him wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. "Carmen Rodriguez," she replied, her arms wrapping protectively around Luna's shoulders. "And I think you need to understand that my daughter has been through tremendous trauma. She creates stories about her father to cope with the loss." Carmen's explanation was delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd had to explain her child's behavior to skeptical adults. But Conrad noticed the way her hands shook slightly as she spoke,
and how her eyes kept darting between his face and Luna's with an expression that suggested she was fighting her own internal battle between hope and self-preservation. "Tell me about Luna's father," Conrad said quietly, crouching back down to Luna's level. Something about this child drew him in ways that transcended logic or caution. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to see him more clearly than people with perfect vision, or maybe it was the strange sense of recognition that had been growing stronger with each passing moment. Luna's face lit up with the kind of joy that children reserved for their favorite stories. "Daddy was tall like you," she said, her hands now exploring Conrad's shoulders and arms with the systematic thoroughness of someone mapping new territory. "Daddy had strong hands that could fix anything. Mama says he could build computers and make them do magic things." Conrad's breath caught. He was indeed tall, and his hands, calloused despite his executive lifestyle from years of tinkering with electronics as a hobby, had indeed built his first computer from spare parts in his college dorm room. But thousands of men in Portland's tech industry could claim similar characteristics. "Luna talks about her father like she knew him," Carmen said, her voice growing defensive. "But the truth is, he died when she was just a baby. She's constructed this whole fantasy based on stories I've told her and photographs she's touched. The doctors say it's her way of coping with abandonment issues." The explanation sounded reasonable, even probable, but Conrad found himself studying Carmen's face for tells, the same micro-expressions he'd learned to read during high-stakes business negotiations. What he saw there wasn't the relieved certainty of a mother correcting a child's misconception. Instead, he saw fear, guilt, and something that looked remarkably like someone working very hard to maintain a necessary lie. "How did he die?" he asked gently. Carmen's composure cracked for just a moment before reassembling itself. "Car accident," she said quickly. 7 years ago. Luna was only 6 months old." 7 years ago. Conrad felt the world shift slightly around him as he did the mental calculation. 7 years ago, he'd been engaged to Rachel, planning their wedding and looking forward to starting a family. 7 years ago, he'd also been dealing with the aftermath of what he had believed was a casual relationship that had ended badly when the woman, he struggled to remember her name, had suddenly disappeared from his life without explanation.
"What was his name?" Conrad asked, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. "Miguel Rodriguez," Carmen said, but her eyes didn't meet his when she spoke. Luna's head tilted with the sharp attention of someone who'd caught a discrepancy in a familiar story. "Mama, why do you always change Daddy's name when people ask?" she said with the innocent directness that only children possessed. "You told me his name was Conrad, just like this nice man." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's face went pale, and Conrad felt his knees nearly buckle as the impossible began to edge toward probable. Luna, oblivious to the adult tension crackling around her, continued her tactile exploration of Conrad's features with the concentrated focus of someone solving a puzzle. "You even smell like Daddy," she announced with satisfaction. "Like that fancy soap and coffee and something else Mama calls computer smell, from working with electronics all the time." Conrad's mind raced through fragments of memory from 7 years ago, a brief but intense relationship with a graduate student named Carmen something. He'd never known her last name. 3 months of stolen evenings and weekend getaways before she'd suddenly stopped returning his calls, disappeared from her apartment, and vanished from his life so completely he'd sometimes wondered if he'd imagined the entire affair. He'd been hurt and confused, but also relieved. He'd been young and focused on building his company, not ready for serious commitment. When Rachel had come into his life 6 months later, he'd convinced himself that Carmen's disappearance had been for the best, clearing the way for what he'd believed was his true love story. "Carmen," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of dawning understanding. "We need to talk, privately." "There's nothing to talk about," Carmen replied. but her voice lacked conviction. "Luna, sweetheart, we need to go back inside. The social worker is waiting, and we can't keep her waiting if we want to find you a good family." But Luna had wrapped her small arms around Conrad's neck with the fierce determination of someone who'd found something precious and wasn't about to let it go. "I don't want a new family," she declared, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I want my real daddy, and I know it's him, Mama. I know it." The child's absolute certainty was both heartbreaking and compelling. Conrad found himself returning her embrace, his expensive suit jacket forgotten as Luna's small body pressed against him with perfect trust. Over her head, he met Carmen's eyes and saw his own growing understanding reflected there. "She's mine, isn't she?" he said quietly. Carmen's defenses finally crumbled. Tears she'd probably been holding back for years began streaming down her face as she nodded silently. "I tried to tell you. 7 years ago, I tried to tell you I was pregnant, but you were so focused on your company, so clear about not wanting complications. And when Rachel came into the picture, the pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Carmen had disappeared because she'd been pregnant and believed, perhaps correctly, that he wouldn't have welcomed the news. She'd raised Luna alone, creating an elaborate fiction about a dead father rather than explaining that the real father simply didn't know she existed. "You should have told me," Conrad said, his voice rough with emotion. "Regardless of everything else, you should have told me I had a daughter." "Would it have mattered?" Carmen asked, her voice carrying 7 years of doubt and self-protection. "You had your perfect life planned out, your perfect fiancé, your perfect future. A single mother and a disabled child didn't fit into that picture." Conrad looked down at Luna, who was still clinging to him with the desperate hope of someone who'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. She did have her father's eyes, but more than that, she had his stubborn determination, his way of tilting his head when concentrating, and his uncanny ability to read people through observation and intuition rather than sight. "You would have mattered," he said firmly. "It would have changed everything." What he didn't say, what he was only beginning to understand, was that it was about to change everything now. The small conference room in the Portland Children's Services building felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Conrad sat across from Carmen and Luna at a scratched wooden table that probably witnessed thousands of similar life-altering conversations. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look tired and defeated before the real discussion had even begun. Luna had refused to let go of Conrad's hand since they'd moved inside, her small fingers intertwined with his, as if physical contact could somehow bridge the 7-year gap between them. Carmen sat rigidly in her chair, alternating between watching her daughter's face and stealing glances at Conrad with an expression that mixed hope, fear, and something that looked remarkably like guilt. "Let me understand this correctly," said Ms. Patricia Hendricks, the social worker who'd been handling Luna's case. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the weary competence of someone who'd seen every possible family configuration life could throw at the system. "Mr. Fisher, you're claiming to be Luna's biological father, despite having no knowledge of her existence until 30 minutes ago?" "I'm not claiming anything," Conrad replied carefully. "I'm trying to understand what happened 7 years ago and why I was never told I might have a daughter." Carmen shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. The confident graduate student he remembered had been replaced by a woman who'd clearly fought battles he couldn't imagine. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hands showed the effects of manual labor, and there was a permanent wariness in her eyes that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust in good outcomes. "Mr. Fisher," Carmen began, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of the conversation, "you need to understand the context of 7 years ago. You were 28 years old, running a startup that consumed every hour of your day. You talked constantly about how relationships were distractions, how you needed to focus entirely on building your company before you could think about settling down." Conrad felt heat rise in his cheeks as he recognized the truth in her words. His younger self had been ambitious to the point of ruthlessness, convinced that any personal entanglements would derail his professional goals. He'd probably said exactly those things, meaning them at the time, without considering how they might sound to someone who was carrying his child. "But I should have been given the chance to step up," he insisted. "Regardless of my age or my priorities, I had a right to know I was going to be a father." "Did you?" Carmen's voice carried an edge of old pain. "Because when I tried to bring up the subject of our future, you made it very clear that you weren't interested in anything serious. You said you were young, that you wanted to keep things casual, that you weren't ready for commitment of any kind." Luna's head swiveled between the adults with the focused attention of someone following a conversation that would determine her entire future. Though she couldn't see their expressions, Conrad realized she was reading their emotional states through voice patterns and body language with the sophisticated skills of someone who'd learned to navigate adult conflicts from a very young age. "Tell me what happened after you left," Conrad said quietly. "Tell me how you ended up here, trying to give away our daughter to strangers." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and Carmen flinched as if he'd struck her. Miss Hendricks intervened with the diplomatic efficiency of someone trained in crisis mediation. "Perhaps we should focus on Luna's current needs," she suggested. "Miss Rodriguez has requested assistance in finding adoptive parents because she feels unable to provide adequate care for a child with special needs. The state's priority is ensuring Luna's welfare, regardless of past circumstances." "What kind of care does she need?" Conrad asked, turning his attention to Luna herself. "Besides her vision, are there other medical concerns?" It was Luna who answered, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children used when discussing things adults found heartbreaking. "I can't see anything, but I can do lots of stuff. I can read with my fingers, and I remember everything people tell me. And I can cook scrambled eggs and fold laundry. Mama says I'm real smart, but that she can't afford the special school where I could learn more things." The simple recitation hit Conrad like a physical blow. Here was his daughter, and he was increasingly certain that's exactly what she was, listing her capabilities like someone applying for a job, trying to prove her worth to potential parents who might take her in. "How much does the special school cost?" he asked Carmen. $35,000 a year, Carmen replied, her voice flat with the resignation of someone who'd done the math too many times. "Plus transportation, adaptive technology, extra tutoring for the subjects they can't accommodate. It might as well be $1 million. Conrad almost laughed at the irony. $35,000 was less than he spent on his car insurance each year. It was a rounding error in his company's quarterly budget, an amount so insignificant to his current financial situation that he probably had it sitting in his checking account earning minimal interest. "What about her medical care?" he pressed. "Are there treatments that could help her vision?" Carmen's expression grew guarded. "There's an experimental surgery being developed at Johns Hopkins, retinal implants that might restore partial sight, but it's still in clinical trials. And even if Luna qualified, the cost would be—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "How much?" Conrad asked. $200,000, maybe more, plus the travel and lodging costs for the extended treatment period. It's not realistic for people like us." People like us. The phrase struck Conrad as fundamentally wrong. Luna wasn't people like Carmen, struggling, overwhelmed, limited by circumstances beyond her control. Luna was his daughter, which meant she had access to resources Carmen couldn't even imagine. "Luna," Conrad said, turning to address the child directly, "what do you want? If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Luna's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the pure honesty that only children possessed. "I want my mama to stop crying when she thinks I can't hear her. I want to go to the school where they teach blind kids how to use computers and read books faster than seeing people. And I want—" She paused, her small hand tightening around his. "I want my daddy to come home so Mama doesn't have to work 3 jobs anymore and we can have dinner together like real families do." The admission revealed so much about their life that Conrad felt his chest tighten with a mixture of guilt and determination. "3 jobs?" he asked Carmen quietly. She nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. cleaning offices early mornings, data entry during Luna's school hours, and restaurant hostess 3 nights a week. It's still not enough for the kind of life Luna deserves, especially with her special needs. Ms. Rodriguez, Miss Hendricks interrupted, consulting her folder. You've indicated that Luna's father was deceased. If Mr. Fisher is indeed her biological father, that changes the legal situation significantly. Carmen looked trapped between her old lies and the new reality unfolding around them. I told people Miguel was dead because it was easier than explaining that her real father didn't know she existed. I gave her his last name because I thought it would be simpler if she never had to answer questions about why her father wasn't around. Conrad found himself studying Luna's profile as she listened to the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone whose future hung in the balance. The shape of her nose was definitely familiar, and when she concentrated, she had the same habit he did of pressing her lips together slightly. But more than physical resemblance, there was something about her intellectual curiosity and her way of processing information that reminded him strongly of himself at that age. We'll need DNA testing to confirm paternity, Miss Hendricks said, making notes in her file. But assuming Mr. Fisher is indeed Luna's father, and assuming he's willing and able to provide care, that would obviously be the preferred outcome for the child. I don't need DNA testing, Conrad said firmly. She's mine. I can see it, and more importantly, I can feel it. He squeezed Luna's hand gently. But I do need to understand what kind of care she requires and what it would take to give her the life she deserves. For the first time since entering the building, Carmen's rigid posture softened slightly. She's incredibly bright, she said, her voice carrying the pride every parent felt when discussing their child's potential. Her teachers say she has exceptional spatial reasoning and memory capabilities. She taught herself to navigate our entire apartment building by sound and touch within a week of moving in. She can identify people by their footstep patterns from 3 floors away. What does she love to do? Conrad asked. Music, Luna answered for herself, her face lighting up with genuine joy for the first time since they'd met. I can play piano, and I'm learning violin, and I love stories, both hearing them and making up my own. And I really want to learn how to use computers like Daddy did. The casual way she referred to him as Daddy sent an unexpected surge of emotion through Conrad's chest. This child had been constructing a relationship with him in her imagination for years, building a connection to a father she'd never met based on fragments of information and pure hope. Then that's what we'll do, Conrad said, making a decision that surprised even him with its certainty. We'll get you the best music teachers, the most advanced computer training, and whatever medical treatments might help your vision. But first, we need to figure out how to become a real family. The word family hung in the air like a promise, and Conrad realized that his carefully planned life had just been completely derailed by a 7-year-old girl who saw him more clearly than anyone with perfect vision ever had. The DNA test results arrived 3 days later, but Conrad had already made his decision long before the laboratory confirmed what his heart had known from the moment Luna touched his face. The official document, with its clinical language and percentage certainties, felt almost anticlimactic compared to the earthquake that had been reshaping his world since that morning outside the library. Conrad stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Fisher Technologies Tower, staring out at the Portland skyline, while his assistant, Janet, waited patiently for instructions about the stack of contracts that normally would have commanded his immediate attention. But everything that seemed critically important just a week ago now felt like background noise compared to the revelation that he was a father. "Sir?" Janet ventured carefully. She'd worked for Conrad for 5 years and had never seen him so distracted. The board meeting is in 20 minutes, and the investors from Tokyo are expecting your presentation on the AI platform. Conrad turned from the window, his mind still processing the conversation he'd had with Carmen the night before. She had agreed to let him spend time with Luna, but her wariness was palpable. 7 years of single motherhood had taught her to be suspicious of promises, especially from men who'd previously shown no interest in commitment. "I concealed the board meeting," Conrad said, causing Janet's eyes to widen in surprise. "Reschedule the Tokyo investors for next week, and clear my calendar for the rest of the day." "Sir, the board won't understand. This presentation has been planned for months and—" "Janet," Conrad interrupted gently, "I've just discovered I have a 7-year-old daughter. The board will have to understand that some things are more important than quarterly projections." What Conrad didn't mention was how Luna's simple existence had already begun changing his perspective on success and priorities in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The fortune he'd spent years accumulating suddenly felt less like an achievement and more like a tool, a means to give his daughter opportunities that had been denied to her by his absence. An hour later, Conrad found himself in a part of Portland he'd never visited, despite living in the city for over a decade. The apartment complex where Carmen and Luna lived was clean but worn, the kind of place where working families stretched every dollar and neighbors knew each other's struggles intimately. As he climbed the stairs to their third-floor unit, Conrad tried to imagine Luna navigating these same steps every day, using sound and touch to create the mental maps that guided her through a world designed for sighted people. Carmen answered his knock with the same guarded expression she'd worn throughout their previous meetings. She'd dressed carefully for his visit, a simple blue dress that had probably been expensive once, but now showed the subtle signs of careful maintenance rather than regular replacement. Her hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the fine bone structure Conrad was beginning to recognize in Luna's face. "She's been talking about you nonstop," Carmen said as she led him into their small living room. "I hope you understand what this means to her. Luna has built up an entire fantasy about having a father who would solve all our problems and make everything perfect. I don't want her to be disappointed when she realizes real life is more complicated than her imagination." The apartment was tiny, but immaculately organized, with everything in its specific place so that Luna could navigate independently. Conrad noticed the braille labels on kitchen cabinets, the textured tape marking important locations, and the careful arrangement of furniture that created clear pathways throughout the space. What struck him most was how every accommodation had been made with love rather than resignation. This wasn't a home adapted for disability, but a space thoughtfully designed around Luna's specific needs and strengths. "Daddy!" Luna's voice called from what he assumed was her bedroom, followed by the sound of careful but confident footsteps. She appeared in the doorway wearing a yellow dress that brought out the warmth in her dark hair, her face bright with excitement that made Conrad's chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. "Hello, sweetheart," Conrad said, crouching down as Luna made her way across the room with the precision of someone who had memorized every potential obstacle. "How are you today?" "I've been practicing," Luna announced proudly, settling onto the couch beside him. "Mama helped me pick out songs to play for you on the piano. Do you want to hear them?" The upright piano wedged into the corner of the living room was obviously old, its wood showing water stains and scratches that spoke of multiple previous owners. But when Luna's small fingers found the keys, the instrument's imperfections became irrelevant. She played with a technical skill that seemed impossible for someone her age, her hands moving across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who understood music as a language rather than a hobby. The melody she chose was hauntingly beautiful, a complex piece that Conrad didn't recognize, but that seemed to tell a story of longing and hope. Luna's face as she played showed a concentration and joy that transformed her from a child struggling with disability into an artist expressing something too deep for words. That was incredible, Conrad said when she finished, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. How long have you been playing? Since I was 4, Luna replied matter-of-factly. Mama found an old keyboard at a garage sale and I just knew how to make it sound right. The music teacher at my school says I have perfect pitch, and that means I can hear when notes are exactly right or wrong. Conrad looked at Carmen, who was watching their interaction with an expression that mixed pride and sadness. She taught herself that piece by listening to a recording from the library, Carmen explained. She can hear a song twice and play it back perfectly. The teachers say she should be studying at a conservatory, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. But conservatories cost money they didn't have. But private lessons were a luxury beyond their reach. But Luna's extraordinary talent was being limited by circumstances that Conrad could change with a simple phone call. "What else do you love to do?" Conrad asked Luna, genuinely curious about the daughter he was still getting to know. "I write stories," Luna said, her face lighting up again. "In my head, because I can't see to write them down yet, but Mama helps me record them sometimes. Do you want to hear one?" Without waiting for an answer, Luna launched into a tale about a blind princess who could hear the thoughts of animals and used her special abilities to save her kingdom from an evil sorcerer. The story was sophisticated beyond her years, with complex plot developments and character motivations that revealed an imagination unrestricted by the visual limitations of her world. As he listened, he found himself thinking about the expensive private schools he'd researched during sleepless nights since learning about Luna's existence. Schools where children like her learned to use cutting-edge technology to read, write, and navigate the world with increasing independence. Schools where her musical talents would be nurtured by master teachers and her storytelling abilities could be developed into real literary skills. "Luna," Conrad said, when she finished her story, "how would you feel about visiting some new schools? Places where they have special programs for students who learn differently?" Luna's head tilted with the careful attention Conrad was learning to recognize as her way of processing important information. "Would Mama come too?" she asked. The question revealed the heart of Luna's deepest fear. Not that she would be abandoned by another adult who made promises, but pursuing new opportunities might somehow separate her from the one person who had never left her side. "Of course Mama would come," Conrad assured her, though he caught Carmen's sharp look that suggested they hadn't discussed any such arrangements. "We're a family now, which means we make decisions together and we don't leave anyone behind." The word family seemed to resonate in the small apartment like a musical chord, creating harmonies and complications that would take time to resolve. Carmen's expression showed she was struggling with the implications of Conrad's casual assumption that they were now a unit, while Luna's face displayed pure joy at the confirmation that her fantasy was becoming reality. What none of them could have predicted was how much more complicated the situation was about to become. Because while Conrad had been discovering his daughter and trying to figure out how to be a father, his absence from Fisher Technologies had not gone unnoticed by people who had their own plans for his company and his fortune. The first indication that his new family situation might have consequences beyond their personal lives came in the form of a text message that arrived as Luna was showing him her collection of audiobooks. The message was from his business partner and CFO, David Chen. "Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Your absence noted by investors. We need to talk." Conrad deleted the message without responding, but the reminder of his other responsibilities cast a shadow over the afternoon's discoveries. Building a relationship with Luna and figuring out how to blend their families would require time and attention that might come at the cost of the business empire he'd spent years creating. What he didn't yet realize was that some of his board members had already begun questioning whether a CEO who would abandon crucial meetings for personal matters was the right person to lead a company valued at over $2 billion.
The battle for his daughter's future was about to become entangled with a battle for his professional survival. The Fisher Technologies boardroom fell silent as Conrad entered, 15 minutes late and carrying a leather portfolio that contained school brochures instead of quarterly reports. The 12 board members seated around the polished mahogany table represented some of Portland's most influential investors, and their expressions ranged from concerned to openly hostile. David Chen, Conrad's longtime business partner and CFO, stood at the head of the table with a presentation already loaded on the wall-mounted screen. His usually supportive demeanor had been replaced by the careful neutrality of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. "Conrad," David said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official business, rather than their usual casual friendship. "Thank you for joining us. We've been discussing some concerning developments regarding your recent personal distractions." Conrad took his seat at the head of the table, noting how the other board members avoided direct eye contact. In the corporate world he'd inhabited for over a decade, such subtle signs usually preceded significant challenges to leadership. He'd orchestrated similar meetings himself when other CEOs had lost focus or made decisions that threatened shareholder value. "If this is about the postponed investor meetings," Conrad began, "I can explain." "It's about more than postponed meetings," interrupted Victoria Sterling, the sharp-edged venture capitalist who'd been one of Fisher Technologies' earliest investors. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression suggested she viewed Conrad's recent behavior as a personal betrayal. David activated the presentation, and Conrad found himself looking at financial projections, stock performance charts, and competitor analysis data that normally would have commanded his complete attention. But today, the numbers seemed less important than the memory of Luna's fingers moving across piano keys with impossible grace. "Our Tokyo partners are questioning whether Fisher Technologies can maintain its competitive edge," David continued, his voice carefully professional. "The AI platform launch represents 18 months of development and over $50 million in investment. Delaying the presentation by even a week could allow our competitors to beat us to market." "1 week," Conrad said, struggling to understand how his board had transformed a minor scheduling adjustment into a corporate crisis. "I asked for 1 week to handle a family emergency." "A family emergency involving a child you didn't know existed until 4 days ago. A child whose mother is clearly seeking financial advantage by suddenly reappearing in your life." The words hit Conrad like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own shock and wonder at discovering Luna that he hadn't considered how others might interpret the situation. From the outside, Carmen's timing might indeed look suspicious, a struggling single mother appearing just as Conrad's company reached new heights of success and valuation. "That's not what this is about," Conrad said firmly, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Had he been naive to accept Carmen's story so readily? Was his desire to believe in Luna's authenticity clouding his judgment about her motivations? "Isn't it?" asked Robert Ashworth, the oldest board member and someone Conrad had considered a mentor. "Conrad, you're a brilliant businessman, but you've always been vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Remember the Henderson acquisition? You let personal feelings cloud your judgment then, and it cost us $12 million.
"This is different," Conrad insisted. "Luna is my daughter. DNA testing confirmed it." "A 7-year-old girl you've known for 4 days?" Victoria replied. "A child whose mother conveniently appeared just as Forbes announced your inclusion on their billionaire list. The timing raises obvious questions." David pulled up another slide showing Conrad's recent media coverage. The Forbes article featured a photo of Conrad at a charity gala, smiling confidently beneath a headline that read, "Portland's youngest tech billionaire shows no signs of slowing down." The article had been published just 2 weeks before Luna had appeared in his life. "Carmen couldn't have known about my financial status," Conrad argued.
though even as he spoke, he realized how hollow the words sounded. His company's success had been widely reported in local media, and his engagement to Rachel 3 years earlier had been featured in Portland's society pages. "Mr. Fisher," said Dr. Margaret Wong, the board's newest member and a clinical psychologist who specialized in corporate decision-making. "From a psychological perspective, your reaction is entirely understandable. The discovery of a child naturally triggers powerful protective instincts and a desire to compensate for lost time. But these same instincts can be exploited by individuals who understand how to present themselves as victims in need of rescue." Conrad found himself thinking about Carmen's careful responses during their conversations, the way she'd seemed almost reluctant to accept his help, her insistence that she didn't want charity. Either she was genuinely struggling with the same conflicted emotions he was, or she was remarkably skilled at manipulation. "What are you suggesting?" Conrad asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A cooling-off period," David said. "Continue your relationship with the child if she is indeed your daughter, but do so gradually and with appropriate legal protections in place. Don't make any major life changes or financial commitments until you've had time to objectively assess the situation. And in the meantime, focus on the company," Victoria said bluntly. "The Tokyo presentation needs to happen this week, not next week. The board needs assurance that Fisher Technologies' leadership remains stable and committed to shareholder value. Your personal life, whatever form it takes, cannot be allowed to jeopardize our market position." Conrad looked around the table at faces that once had shown him respect and support, but now reflected doubt and concern. These people had believed in his vision when Fisher Technologies was just an idea, had backed his decisions through multiple market downturns and competitive challenges. Their current skepticism wasn't born from malice, but from genuine worry about the company they'd all helped build. "How long?" Conrad asked quietly. 6 months, Robert said. "Maintain minimal contact with this woman and her child while we conduct a thorough background investigation. If everything checks out and you still want to pursue a relationship with them, the board will support your decision." 6 months? Conrad's voice rose, despite his efforts to remain calm. "You want me to abandon my daughter for 6 months while you decide whether she's worth the risk to quarterly projections? We want you to make rational decisions based on facts rather than emotions. If this child is genuinely your daughter and her mother's motives are pure, they'll still be there in 6 months. If this is an elaborate scheme to access your fortune, time will reveal the truth." The logic was sound from a business perspective, and Conrad recognized the wisdom in their cautious approach, but the memory of Luna's absolute certainty when she touched his face, her joy when she played piano for him, and her innocent assumption that he would naturally want to be part of his life made the board's calculated pragmatism feel like betrayal. "And if I refuse?" Conrad asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. David finally spoke, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The board would be forced to consider whether Fisher Technologies needs new leadership, someone whose personal situation doesn't compromise their ability to focus on company priorities." Conrad stared at the financial projections on the screen, numbers that represented years of work in innovation, the foundation of a business empire that had defined his adult life. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved was being held hostage to his board's fear that a 7-year-old girl might somehow derail their corporate success. "I need time to think," Conrad said finally. "Of course," David replied. "But Conrad, understand that the Tokyo investors won't wait indefinitely. We need your decision by tomorrow morning." As Conrad left the boardroom, he found himself facing an impossible choice. He could abandon Luna and Carmen to protect the company he'd spent his career building, or he could risk everything he achieved for a relationship with a daughter he'd known for less than a week. What he didn't know was that Luna and Carmen were facing their own crisis, one that would make his corporate dilemmas seem trivial by comparison. Because while his board was questioning his judgment, social services had begun to question whether Carmen's newfound connection to a billionaire represented a fundamental change in Luna's custody situation that required immediate intervention. The battle for Luna's future was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, jarring Conrad from the first decent sleep he'd managed since the board meeting. Carmen's voice was tight with panic, her usual careful composure completely shattered. "They took her," Carmen said without preamble. "Social services came this morning with a court order. They said Luna's living situation had changed and that they needed to reassess her placement while they investigate the new circumstances."
Conrad sat up in his king-sized bed, his mind struggling to process what Carmen was telling him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, Portland was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday, but his world had just tilted off its axis for the second time in a week. "What do you mean they took her? Where is Luna now?" "Emergency foster care," Carmen's voice cracked. "They said that my connection to someone of your financial status raised questions about my previous claims regarding Luna's father. They want to investigate whether I've been defrauding the system by claiming single-parent benefits while having access to significant resources." Conrad was already moving, pulling on clothes with one hand while keeping the phone pressed to his ear. "That's insane. I've known about Luna for exactly 6 days. There's no fraud involved." "Try explaining that to Mrs. Hendricks. According to her, the fact that you exist at all means I've been lying about Luna's circumstances for years. She says they need to determine whether Luna's best interests are served by staying with me or being placed in a home that can better meet her special needs." The irony wasn't lost on Conrad. Just 12 hours earlier, his board had been questioning whether his relationship with Luna was legitimate. Now, social services was questioning whether Carmen had been hiding that relationship for personal gain. Luna, the innocent center of both controversies, was the one paying the price for adult suspicions and bureaucratic protocols. "Which foster home?" Conrad asked, already heading for his private elevator. "The Morrison family on the east side, but Conrad, you can't just show up there. Mrs. Hendricks made it very clear that any contact between Luna and either of us needs to be supervised and pre-approved until their investigation is complete." Conrad found himself in the impossible position of being Luna's father, but having no legal rights to see her, comfort her, or protect her from a system that had decided she needed protection from the people who loved her most. The man who could buy and sell companies with a phone call was powerless to help a 7-year-old girl who was probably terrified and confused about why she'd been taken from the only stable home she'd ever known. "How long did these investigations typically take?" Conrad asked, as his driver navigated through morning traffic toward the east side address Carmen had given him. "Weeks, sometimes months." Carmen's voice was hollow with exhaustion. "And Conrad, there's something else. Mrs. Hendricks asked a lot of questions about your board meeting yesterday. Someone contacted their office about your mental state and whether you were making rational decisions regarding Luna." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Conrad's board hadn't just threatened his position, they'd actively sabotaged his relationship with his daughter by planting seeds of doubt with social services. Victoria Sterling's connections in the legal community were extensive, and her reputation for ruthless protection of her investments was well known throughout Portland's business circles. "Those bastards," Conrad muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, this is all my fault. If I hadn't canceled those meetings, if I'd handled the situation more quietly." "This isn't your fault," Carmen said firmly. "This is what happens when people with power decide that ordinary families don't deserve to make their own choices. But Conrad, we need to be smart about this. Any mistake we make now could give them ammunition to keep Luna away from both of us permanently." The Morrison house was a modest 2-story home in a neighborhood of similar family residences. Conrad sat in his car across the street, staring at the building where his daughter was being held by well-meaning strangers who had no idea that she was probably listening for his voice, waiting for the father she'd just found to come rescue her from another abandonment. His phone buzzed with a text from David. "Tokyo investors threatening to pull out. Board meeting at 10 a.m. We need you there." Conrad stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it without response. His board wanted him to choose between his company and his daughter, but they'd failed to understand that their interference had already made that choice for him. By involving social services, they'd escalated a personal matter into a legal battle that required his complete attention. Carmen appeared on the sidewalk, having apparently taken public transportation to reach the foster home. She moved with the determined stride of someone who'd made a difficult decision and was prepared to face the consequences. When she saw Conrad's car, she crossed the street with the careful precision of someone trying not to appear suspicious to any social workers who might be watching. "Any word from Mrs. Hendricks?" Conrad asked as Carmen slipped into the passenger seat. "She's agreed to meet with us this afternoon, but only to discuss the investigation timeline and visitation protocols. She made it very clear that Luna's placement isn't negotiable until their review is complete." Through the front window of the Morrison house, Conrad caught a glimpse of movement. A small figure in a yellow dress sitting at what appeared to be a piano. Even from a distance, he could see Luna's posture was different, more withdrawn than the confident child he'd been getting to know. "She's playing," Carmen observed, following his gaze. "She always plays when she's scared or confused. It's how she processes emotions she can't understand." As if summoned by their attention, Luna's head turned toward the window with the uncanny awareness Conrad was learning to associate with her heightened hearing. Even though she couldn't see him, he had the distinct impression she knew he was there. "We have to get her back," Conrad said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised him with its intensity. "How?" Carmen asked. "Mrs. Hendricks has all the power here. She can keep Luna in foster care for as long as she deems necessary. And your board's interference has given her legitimate reasons to question both our motives and our stability." Conrad pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Marcus Reed, Portland's most expensive family law attorney. If his board wanted to play hardball with his daughter's welfare, they were about to discover that two could play that game. "Marcus? It's Conrad Fisher. I need you to drop everything you're doing and meet me at your office in an hour. I'm fighting for custody of my daughter, and social services has decided I'm a threat to her welfare." The conversation that followed was brief and professional, but Marcus's reputation for aggressive litigation was exactly what Conrad needed. If the system wanted to treat Luna like a case file rather than a child with two parents who loved her, then Conrad would use every legal and financial resource at his disposal to remind them that some fights were worth more than their careers. "Conrad," Carmen said quietly as he ended the call, "if we do this, if we really fight them, it's going to get ugly. They'll dig into every aspect of our lives, question every decision we've made. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Conrad looked back at the house where Luna was playing piano for strangers, her music carrying through the window like a plea for the adults in her life to stop treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a child to be loved. "They started this fight when they decided my relationship with Luna was a threat to their precious quarterly projections," Conrad said. "Now they're going to learn that taking my daughter away from me was the biggest mistake they've ever made." What Conrad didn't know was that his board's interference had attracted attention from other quarters. Victoria Sterling's connections extended beyond the legal community into Portland's media landscape, and the story of a tech billionaire's secret love child was exactly the kind of scandal that sold newspapers and generated clicks. By evening, the battle for Luna would become a public spectacle that would test every relationship and assumption in Conrad's carefully constructed world. The headline on the Portland Tribune's website made Conrad's blood run cold. "Tech billionaire's secret love child. A 7-year custody battle unfolds." Below it, a smaller subheading read, "Fisher Technology CEO's company future in question as personal drama explodes into public view." Marcus Reed's law office had become a war room by 10 o'clock that morning. The conference table was covered with legal documents, newspaper printouts, and transcripts of the early morning news broadcasts that had somehow obtained detailed information about Luna's situation. Conrad sat at one end of the table, his usual corporate composure replaced by the raw fury of a father whose child had become tabloid fodder. "How do they get this information?" Conrad demanded, holding up his phone which displayed a photo of Luna being led into the Morrison house by a social worker. The image had clearly been taken with a telephoto lens, turning a traumatic moment into entertainment for strangers. "My guess would be someone with access to social services records," Marcus replied grimly. The attorney was in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd fought high-profile battles in Portland's family courts for 3 decades. The level of detail in these articles suggests more than just speculation or gossip. Carmen sat across from Conrad, her face pale as she scrolled through her own phone. They're calling me a fortune hunter and suggesting that Luna's blindness makes her a sympathetic pawn in my scheme to access your money. One article actually questions whether Luna is really blind or if I've been coaching her to fake it. The accusation was so grotesque that Conrad felt physically sick. The idea that anyone could look at Luna's obvious visual impairment and see calculation rather than genuine disability spoke to a level of cynicism that he hadn't believed possible. "What about Luna?" Conrad asked. "Have the Morrison seen these articles?" "That's our biggest concern," Marcus said, pulling up another browser tab. Channel 12 ran a segment this morning featuring expert commentary about children caught in high-profile custody disputes. They're treating Luna like she's some kind of celebrity, rather than a 7-year-old girl who's been separated from everyone she loves. Conrad's phone rang, displaying David Chen's number for the 5th time that morning. He'd been ignoring the calls, but the persistence suggested the situation at Fisher Technologies had reached a crisis level. "I should take this," Conrad said, stepping away from the table. "David, what's the damage?" "Complete disaster." David's voice was tight with stress. Stock price dropped 12% in pre-market trading. The Tokyo investors pulled out an hour ago, citing leadership instability and personal scandals. 3 major clients have called emergency meetings to discuss whether their contracts are secure given the current situation. Conrad closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decisions made in anger and desperation. His attempt to fight for Luna had triggered exactly the kind of corporate crisis his board had feared, validating their concerns while simultaneously making it harder for him to provide the stable environment social services required for Luna's return.
"What does the board want?" Conrad asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Emergency vote of no confidence scheduled for this afternoon. Victoria has been calling shareholders since 6 a.m., arguing that your erratic behavior and compromised judgment make you unfit to lead a publicly traded company." The irony was devastating. Conrad's board had created the crisis they now pointed to as justification for removing him from power. Their interference with social services had triggered the media attention that was destroying his company's value and his daughter's privacy simultaneously. "And if I step down voluntarily?" Conrad asked. "They might allow you to retain controlling interest while bringing in an interim CEO. You'd keep your fortune but lose operational control. The company you build would essentially be managed by committee." Conrad returned to the conference cable, where Marcus and Carmen were reviewing strategy documents with the grim efficiency of people preparing for siege warfare. "The media attention changes everything," Marcus explained. "Social services will be under intense public scrutiny regarding their handling of Luna's case. That could work in our favor if we can control the narrative, but it also means any mistakes we make will be amplified and analyzed by millions of people." "What kind of mistakes?" Carmen asked. "Anything that makes you look like opportunists rather than concerned parents. Expensive lawyers, flashy public relations moves, attempts to use Conrad's wealth to circumvent normal procedures. The system is already suspicious of your motives. We can't give them ammunition to justify those suspicions." Conrad found himself caught between impossible alternatives. Fighting aggressively for Luna risked confirming the narrative that he was an arrogant billionaire trying to buy his way out of consequences. But accepting the system's timeline meant leaving his daughter in foster care while bureaucrats decided whether her own parents were suitable guardians. "There's something else," Carmen said quietly. "Mrs. Hendricks called this morning. The media attention has complicated Luna's placement with the Morrisons. They're ordinary people who didn't sign up to have reporters camping outside their house and photographers trying to get pictures of Luna through their windows." "Are they asking for Luna to be moved?" Marcus asked. "They're considering it, which means Luna could be moved to a second foster home, further traumatizing her and resetting any adjustment she's made to her current situation." Conrad felt his carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. His daughter was being treated like a political football, moved from place to place based on adult convenience rather than her emotional needs. The system that claimed to protect children was subjecting Luna to exactly the kind of instability and abandonment that had originally brought her to social services attention. "We need to see her," Conrad said firmly. Whatever the procedures, whatever the risks, Luna needs to know that we haven't abandoned her. Conrad, Marcus warned, any contact has to be supervised and pre-approved. If you violate their protocols, even with the best intentions, they can use it as evidence that you don't respect boundaries or follow rules. It could permanently damage your custody case. Then set up the supervised visit, but I'm not letting my daughter think that her father disappeared the moment things got complicated. Carmen looked up from her phone with an expression of renewed horror. There's more. Someone leaked information about Luna's medical needs to the press. They're reporting that she's a candidate for experimental surgery that could restore her sight, and they're speculating about whether I kept her condition untreated to make her more sympathetic for custody purposes. The accusation was so twisted that Conrad struggled to process it. The idea that Carmen would deliberately deny medical care to her own child for strategic advantage revealed the depths of cynicism that money and media attention could generate. Who would have access to her medical records? Marcus asked. Dr. Harrison, the specialists we consulted, social services, the school district. Carmen listed, her voice growing smaller with each possibility. Any one of them could have leaked information either deliberately or accidentally. Conrad's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Enjoying the spotlight? This is what happens when you threaten people who have more power than you realize. Drop the custody fight, and maybe the media attention goes away. Continue and watch what happens to your daughter's privacy. The message was clearly a threat, but from whom? His board? Social services? Media outlets looking for continued content? The anonymity made it impossible to respond effectively, adding another layer of helplessness to an already overwhelming situation. "We're fighting ghosts," Conrad said, showing the message to Marcus and Carmen. "Someone with influence is orchestrating this campaign to destroy Luna's life and our chances of getting her back. But we can't identify them, much less stop them." Marcus studied the message with the analytical intensity of someone who'd seen similar tactics before. This suggests coordination between multiple parties. The leak to media, the social services interference, the corporate pressure. It's too organized to be coincidental. "Victoria Sterling," Conrad said with sudden certainty. "She has connections in media, legal, and corporate circles. If anyone could coordinate this kind of campaign, it would be her." "Can we prove it?" Carmen asked. "Proving it and stopping it are two different things," Marcus replied grimly. "Even if we can identify the source, the damage to Luna's privacy and your reputations may have already been irreversible." As if summoned by their conversation, Conrad's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, a familiar voice made his stomach clench with dread. "Mr. Fisher, this is Mrs. Hendricks from Social Services. We need to meet immediately. The media attention surrounding Luna's case has created complications that require immediate intervention." The tone of her voice suggested that whatever complications had arisen would not be working in Luna's favor. Conrad looked at Carmen and Marcus, seeing his own fears reflected in their expressions. The battle for Luna was about to enter a new phase, one where the very people meant to protect her would become her greatest threat. The social services office felt like a tribunal as Conrad and Carmen sat across from Mrs. Hendricks, who had been joined by her supervisor, Regional Director James Paulson, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist whose presence suggested the situation had escalated beyond routine custody review. "The media coverage has created an untenable situation," Mrs. Hendricks began without preamble. Her usual professional demeanor had been replaced by the defensive posture of someone whose department was under public scrutiny. "Luna's case has become a circus, and our primary concern must be protecting her from further exploitation." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering difficult news. "I've reviewed Luna's psychological profile and conducted a preliminary assessment based on reports from her current foster placement. The child is exhibiting signs of severe emotional distress that go beyond normal adjustment difficulties." "What kind of signs?" Carmen asked, her voice tight with worry. "Sleep disturbances, loss of appetite, and most concerning, she stopped speaking entirely except to ask repeatedly when her daddy is coming to take her home. Dr. Mitchell consulted her notes. The Foster family reports that she spends most of her time at the piano, playing the same melancholy pieces over and over. When they try to engage her in other activities, she becomes withdrawn and unresponsive. Conrad felt his chest tighten with the image of Luna, confused and frightened, using music as her only means of communication in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and threatening. The confident, joyful child he'd been getting to know had been replaced by someone traumatized by the very system meant to protect her. "She's grieving," Carmen said quietly. "Luna forms deep attachments quickly because she's learned to read people through emotional cues rather than visual ones. Being separated from everyone she trusts feels like abandonment to her, especially after just finding Conrad." "Which brings us to our immediate concern," Director Paulson interjected. His silver hair and expensive suit suggested someone more comfortable in political meetings than child welfare offices. "The department is facing intense pressure from multiple sources. We've received calls from city council members, state legislators, and federal officials expressing concern about how this case is being handled." Conrad exchanged glances with Carmen, both recognizing the implication. The pressure wasn't coming from people concerned about Luna's welfare. It was coming from individuals with connections to Fisher Technologies' board or their political allies. "What kind of pressure?" Marcus Reed asked, from his position beside Conrad. The attorney had insisted on attending the meeting despite social services' initial resistance to legal representation. "Questions about our protocols, suggestions that we're either being manipulated by wealthy individuals or that we're discriminating against them based on their financial status," Mrs. Hendricks replied. "The department's credibility is being questioned from multiple angles." Dr. Mitchell pulled out a tablet and showed them a series of news articles and social media posts. The media narrative has become increasingly polarized. Half the coverage portrays Mr. Fisher as a deadbeat father trying to buy his way into his daughter's life, while the other half suggests that social services is punishing Luna for having a wealthy parent. Neither narrative serves Luna's actual interests. "So what are you proposing?" Conrad asked, though he suspected the answer would not be in Luna's favor. Director Paulson opened a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. Given the unprecedented media attention and the concerns about Luna's emotional state, the department has decided to recommend temporary placement with a specialized facility that can better address her unique needs. "What kind of facility?" Carmen's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "The Riverside Children's Center specializes in caring for children with disabilities during family transition periods. They have staff trained in working with visually impaired children, and their policies regarding media access are much more restrictive than typical foster homes." Conrad felt the blood drain from his face. They were proposing to institutionalize his daughter, not because she needed institutional care, but because the adults in her life had created a media spectacle that made normal placement impossible. "For how long?" Marcus asked. "Until the investigation is complete, an appropriate permanent placement can be arranged. Given the complexity of this case, we're estimating 6 to 8 months minimum." 8 months? Carmen stood up abruptly, her careful composure finally cracking. "You want to put Luna in an institution for 8 months because some reporter decided her story would sell newspapers? She's 7 years old, not a criminal." "Ms. Rodriguez, please understand that this recommendation is being made in Luna's best interests," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "The Riverside Center has excellent programs for children with visual impairments, and the structured environment might actually benefit her development." "Luna doesn't need programs," Conrad said, his voice carrying the controlled fury he'd learned to use in hostile business negotiations. "She needs her family. She needs stability and love and the people who've been caring for her since birth." Mrs. Hendricks consulted her notes again. "Mr. Fisher, with respect, you've known about Luna's existence exactly 9 days. Your claim to be essential to her emotional well-being is somewhat premature." The observation stung,
because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Conrad had indeed been absent from Luna's life for 7 years, but not by choice. The system that was now questioning his commitment had been denied the opportunity to develop naturally because Carmen believed, perhaps correctly, that he wouldn't have welcomed the responsibility of fatherhood.
What would it take to reverse this recommendation? Marcus asked, switching to negotiation mode. Director Paulson and Mrs. Hendricks exchanged glances that suggested they'd anticipated this question. Complete withdrawal from public attention, Paulson said. No media statements, no legal challenges to our procedures, no attempts to use wealth or influence to accelerate the investigation timeline. And in return? Conrad asked. Luna could remain in foster care rather than institutional placement with supervised visitation rights for both parents pending completion of our investigation. Conrad recognized the ultimatum for what it was: surrender his right to fight for his daughter, accept the system's timeline and procedures without question, and hope that bureaucratic mercy would eventually reunite their family. How long for visitation to begin? Carmen asked. 2 weeks, minimum. We need time for the media attention to die down and for Luna to adjust to her new placement routine. 2 more weeks of separation for a child who was already traumatized by abandonment. Conrad thought about Luna sitting at a piano in a stranger's house, playing melancholy music while waiting for a father who wasn't allowed to contact her. And if we don't agree to these terms? Marcus asked. Then we proceed with institutional placement and recommend against unsupervised contact pending completion of a more extensive investigation that could take up to a year, Dr. Mitchell said matter-of-factly. The choice was designed to be impossible: accept terms that felt like capitulation or risk Luna's placement in an institutional setting that would separate her even further from the people who loved her. Conrad's phone vibrated with another text from David Chen. Board vote moved up to 2 p.m. Victoria has enough support to remove you. Last chance to resign voluntarily and maintain some control. The timing wasn't coincidental. His board was forcing a simultaneous crisis that required him to choose between fighting for his company and fighting for his daughter, knowing that he couldn't effectively do both. We need time to consider your recommendation, Marcus said diplomatically. Of course, but understand that media attention continues to intensify. Every day we delay increases the risk that Luna's privacy will be further compromised. As they left the social services building, Conrad found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. He could accept the system's terms and hope that compliance would eventually restore his relationship with Luna, or he could continue fighting and risk losing her to an institutional setting where she might disappear into bureaucratic procedures for months or even years. "What do you think?" he asked Carmen as they reached their cars. "I think they're using Luna as a hostage to force our compliance, but I also think that fighting them might hurt her more than helping her." Conrad looked back at the social services building, wondering if Luna somehow knew that her parents were being forced to choose between principle and pragmatism in a game where she was the prize and the victim simultaneously. The decision he made in the next few hours would determine not just his own future, but the trajectory of his daughter's childhood and the possibility that their family might someday heal from the wounds that others had inflicted in the name of protecting her interests. Conrad stood in his empty boardroom at Fisher Technologies, staring at the resignation letter he'd drafted but not yet signed. Outside, Portland's skyline stretched toward the mountains, the same view that inspired him during countless late nights, building his company from a startup dream into a billion-dollar empire. In 2 hours, his board would vote on his removal, but he'd already made a decision that would shock them more than any corporate maneuvering they'd planned. The door opened behind him, and David Chen entered with the weary expression of someone who'd spent sleepless nights trying to salvage a friendship along with a business relationship. "The votes are locked in," David said quietly. "Victoria has 9 of the 12 board members committed to removal. I'm sorry, Conrad. I tried to buy you more time, but the Tokyo situation and the media coverage made it impossible. Conrad turned from the window, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from finally understanding what mattered most. David, what if I told you that everything we think we know about this situation is wrong? What if Luna's appearance in my life wasn't coincidence or manipulation, but something else entirely? What do you mean? Conrad pulled out his laptop and opened a folder of documents he'd spent the previous night assembling with the help of a private investigator he'd hired to dig deeper into Carmen's background. Look at this timeline. Carmen disappeared from my life 7 years and 9 months ago, right? Luna is 7 years old, but here's what's interesting. Carmen wasn't a graduate student when we met. She was an undercover journalist working on an expose about tech industry culture. Journalist? Carmen Rodriguez was a staff writer for Portland Monthly magazine until 8 years ago. She was investigating stories about tech executives and their personal lives for a piece about work-life balance in the startup world. So she was using you for a story? Initially, yes, but here's where it gets complicated. Conrad pulled up another document, a hospital record from 7 years ago. Carmen was admitted to Portland General 8 months after she disappeared from my life. Emergency complications during pregnancy. The admissions forms list her as single mother, father deceased.
David studied the medical records with growing confusion. But if Luna is your daughter, Carmen lied on the hospital forms, Conrad continued, but not for the reasons everyone assumes. Look at this. He opened another file containing financial records. Carmen's magazine salary was $38,000 a year. She had no family support, no trust fund, no savings. When she discovered she was pregnant with a disabled child who would require extensive medical care and special education, she panicked. The pieces of the puzzle began forming a picture that was far more complex than either manipulation or coincidence. David sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs surrounding the conference table. She was protecting Luna from you? David asked. She was protecting Luna from poverty, Conrad corrected. Think about it. Carmen knew from her research that I was obsessively focused on building the company. She'd seen how I treated personal relationships as distractions. A pregnant journalist dating her interview subject would have been a professional scandal for her and a potential legal liability for me. But more importantly, she'd interviewed enough tech executives to know that disabled children were often viewed as expensive inconveniences by men focused on building fortunes. Conrad opened one final document, a draft article that had never been published. I found this on an old backup drive that Carmen abandoned when she disappeared. It's the piece she was writing about tech culture and family priorities. Look at the quotes she collected from anonymous executives. David read silently, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. The article contained devastating observations about how successful men often abandoned families when children required special care, how financial success was used to justify emotional absence, and how the tech industry's worship of efficiency created environments hostile to anything that required patience and long-term commitment. Children with disabilities are portfolio drags. David read aloud from one quote. Smart executives know when to cut their losses and focus on ventures with better ROI. This is sickening. Carmen read these interviews and realized that revealing Luna's paternity would likely result in me paying child support while maintaining minimal contact. She'd researched dozens of similar situations, wealthy fathers who treated disabled children like tax deductions rather than family members. The timeline made devastating sense. Carmen had entered their relationship as a journalist investigating a story about executive privilege and family responsibility. She discovered she was pregnant just as her research revealed how men in Conrad's position typically handled such complications. Rather than risk Luna becoming another case study in paternal abandonment, she'd chosen to disappear entirely. But why reveal the truth now? What changed? Conrad pulled up the final piece of evidence, a medical report from Johns Hopkins that had been forwarded to Carmen just 3 weeks earlier. Luna's condition is deteriorating faster than expected. The experimental surgery that could restore her sight has a limited window of opportunity. If she doesn't receive treatment within the next year, she'll lose any chance of ever seeing. The medical urgency had forced Carmen to overcome 7 years of fear and pride. She'd brought Luna Cadet Library not to seek financial advantage, but to give her daughter one last opportunity to know her father before making the desperate choice to surrender her to a system that might be able to provide the care Carmen couldn't afford. She was giving Luna away because she loves her, David said quietly, finally understanding the true scope of Carmen's sacrifice. And Luna's recognition of my eyes wasn't mystical childhood intuition. Carmen had been showing her photographs and telling her stories about her father for years, preparing her for the possibility that someday she might need to find me herself. David stared at the evidence spread across the conference table, his expression cycling through shock, admiration, and something that looked like shame. Conrad, if this is true, then everything the board assumed about this situation was completely wrong, Conrad finished. Carmen isn't a fortune hunter. She's a mother who spent 7 years researching every possible option for her daughter's care before finally concluding that the father she'd protected Luna from might be Luna's only hope for the medical treatment she needs. The realization reframed everything that had happened since Luna's appearance in Conrad's life. Carmen's reluctance to accept help, her careful questioning about his commitment to Luna, her obvious discomfort with his wealth, all of it made sense if she'd spent years convinced that revealing Luna's paternity would likely result in emotional abandonment disguised as financial obligation. "What are you going to do?" David asked. Conrad picked up the resignation letter he drafted and tore it in half. "I'm going to prove that Carmen was wrong about me 7 years ago, and I'm going to make sure Luna gets the surgery that could restore her sight. But first, I'm going to walk into that boardroom and tell Victoria Sterling and her allies exactly what kind of people they've revealed themselves to be." David looked alarmed. "Conrad, if you attack the board directly, they'll destroy you. Your reputation, your wealth, your ability to provide for Luna, they'll take everything." "Let them try," Conrad replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. "David, I built this company to prove I could create something valuable. But I've just discovered that the most valuable thing in my life is a 7-year-old girl who's been waiting 7 years for her father to prove he deserves her love."
As Conrad gathered the evidence that would transform the board meeting from a corporate power struggle into a moral reckoning, he realized that Luna's appearance in his life hadn't been about coincidence or manipulation. It had been about redemption, the opportunity to become the man Carmen had hoped he might be when she'd first begun researching his character, and the father Luna deserved regardless of how much it cost him to prove worthy of that title. The battle for Luna was about to shift from defensive survival to aggressive offense, and Conrad was finally ready to fight with the full force of both his resources and his convictions. The Fisher Technologies boardroom had never witnessed anything like the scene that unfolded when Conrad entered at exactly 2 o'clock. Instead of the contrite executive they'd expected, someone prepared to negotiate terms of departure or plead for clemency, Conrad walked in with the controlled fury of someone who'd discovered he'd been fighting the wrong battle entirely. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the table where Conrad usually presided, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was assured. The other board members had arranged themselves with the careful positioning of people participating in a corporate execution, their faces reflecting varying degrees of discomfort with the proceedings they'd been convinced were necessary. "Conrad," Victoria began, with false warmth, "we appreciate you joining us despite the difficult circumstances. We'd hoped to handle this transition more smoothly, but recent events have forced our hand." Conrad remained standing, placing a thick folder on the table with deliberate precision. "Before we discuss any transitions, I think the board should understand exactly what recent events they've been orchestrating." Dr. Margaret Wong, the psychologist board member, shifted uncomfortably. "Conrad, we understand you're upset, but the company's stability must take precedence over personal matters. The stock price, the investor confidence, the media attention?" "The media attention that you created," Conrad interrupted, his voice cutting through the room's artificial politeness like a blade. "Victoria, would you like to explain to the board how your contact at Channel 12 obtained confidential information about my daughter's custody case?" Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment before reassembling itself. "I have no idea what you're implying." Conrad opened the folder and spread documents across the polished table. Phone records showing 17 calls between your personal cell phone and Rebecca Martinez at Channel 12 over the past week. Email communications between your assistant and social services administrators. Financial records showing payments to a private investigation firm that specializes in, and I quote, "strategic intelligence gathering for corporate reputation management." The other board members leaned forward to examine the evidence, their expressions shifting from uncomfortable solidarity to shocked recognition of the scope of Victoria's manipulation. "You didn't just threaten my position, you deliberately sabotaged my relationship with my daughter to protect your investment. You leaked confidential information about a 7-year-old disabled child to create media pressure that would force me to choose between my company and my family." Robert Ashworth, the elderly board member who'd served as Conrad's mentor, looked genuinely horrified as he studied the phone records. "Victoria, please tell me this isn't what it appears to be." "Everything I did was in the best interests of Fisher Technologies and our shareholders," Victoria replied, her voice taking on the defensive edge of someone whose tactics had been exposed. "Conrad's emotional involvement with this situation was compromising his judgment and threatening the company's stability." "A 7-year-old child," Conrad said quietly, his controlled fury more devastating than shouting would have been. "You destroyed the privacy and traumatized the mental health of a 7-year-old child to protect quarterly projections." David Chen, who had been silent until now, pulled out his own folder of documents. "There's more the board should know before proceeding with any votes of no confidence." Conrad nodded at his business partner, grateful for the support he hadn't been certain he could count on. David's expression carried the weight of someone who'd spent sleepless nights wrestling with conscience and loyalty. "I've spent the past week analyzing our corporate decision-making patterns over the past 3 years, specifically decisions influenced by Victoria's recommendations regarding mergers, acquisitions, and strategic partnerships." Victoria's face went pale as David began spreading financial analysis across the table. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating that Victoria Sterling has systematically steered Fisher Technologies towards investments that benefit companies in which she holds significant but undisclosed personal stakes. The Henderson acquisition that she blamed for Conrad, Victoria personally profited $2.7 million from that supposedly failed merger." The revelation hit the boardroom like a physical shockwave. Conrad felt his own surprise mixing with vindication as the scope of Victoria's long-term manipulation became clear. "That's impossible," Dr. Wong said, reaching for the financial documents. "Board members are required to disclose conflicts of interest." Through a complex network of shell companies and investment partnerships that took our forensic accountants 3 days to untangle, Victoria has been using her position on our board to engineer deals that appeared to fail from Fisher Technologies' perspective but generated substantial personal profits for her portfolio companies. Conrad watched as the other board members processed the magnitude of Victoria's betrayal. The woman who had positioned herself as the guardian of corporate integrity had been systematically looting the company while building cases against executives who threatened her influence. The Tokyo investors didn't withdraw because of media attention about Conrad's personal life. They withdrew because Victoria's contact told them that Fisher Technologies was considering a merger with Yamamoto Company, a company that Victoria's investment firm has been positioning to acquire our intellectual property at below-market prices.
Victoria stood abruptly, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking entirely. This is character assassination based on conspiracy theories and circumstantial evidence. The board called this meeting to address Conrad's fitness for leadership, not to pursue vindictive attacks on board members who've been embezzling from the company, Conrad finished. Victoria, you're right that this meeting is about fitness for leadership, but you've proven that the greatest threat to Fisher Technologies isn't my relationship with my daughter. It's your relationship with our competitors. Robert Ashworth was studying the financial documents with the focused attention of someone who'd built his own fortune through careful analysis of exactly these kinds of patterns. Conrad, these numbers suggest systematic fraud over multiple years. If this analysis is accurate, Victoria has cost us over $40 million in lost opportunities and deliberately sabotaged deals, while simultaneously attacking the CEO who might have discovered her activities if he hadn't been distracted by engineered personal crises. Dr. Wong added, her psychological training apparently extending to recognizing manipulation tactics. Conrad felt a grim satisfaction as the board members who'd been prepared to remove him began turning their attention toward the person who'd actually been betraying their trust. But his victory felt hollow compared to the knowledge that Luna was still trapped in a system that Victoria's interference had made exponentially more complicated. The question now, Conrad said, is whether this board is going to continue enabling someone who's been stealing from our company and traumatizing children to protect her criminal activities, or whether you're going to help me fix the damage she's caused. Victoria gathered her papers with shaking hands, her corporate armor finally stripped away to reveal the desperation underneath. You have no idea what you're unleashing, Conrad. The connections I've built, the relationships that protect this company. Without my influence, Fisher Technologies will be destroyed by competitors who understand how business really works. Then we'll find out, Conrad replied. But we'll do it with clean hands and clear consciences. As Victoria stormed from the boardroom, followed by the 2 board members who'd been most clearly aligned with her faction, Conrad realized that winning this corporate battle was only the beginning. Luna was still in foster care. Carmen was still fighting a system designed to wear down parents without resources, and the media attention that Victoria had orchestrated would continue to complicate their custody case, regardless of its corporate origins. But for the first time since Luna had touched his face and changed his world, Conrad felt like he was fighting the right battle against the right enemies. The question now was whether clearing his name and exposing Victoria's crimes would be enough to convince social services that Luna belonged with the parents who loved her, rather than in an institutional system that treated her like a case number. The real test of his fitness as a father was just beginning.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.